What's happening, everybody? I am the other Steve, and welcome back to the House of Kayfabe. I am, of course, here with the heavyweight champion trial lawyer of the world, a man who is so famous they named a river after him, Stephen P. New. What's happening, brother?
Hey, how are you doing, Steve? It's great to be with you, man.
Well, man, one of the best things about having you in my contact list is when I have law questions, I have someone to go to. And what's even better is when I have law questions that involve wrestling, I have someone I can go to. So a couple weeks ago on the God Emperor's podcast, when this particular picture started making its rounds on the internet, the great Brian Last said this was probably a subject for Stephen P. New. Well, too fucking bad, great Brian Last. I have Stephen P. New. And we're going to talk about this liability, what would you call it? Disclaimer that AEW shows at the beginning of their shows.
Yes, it's called AEW Fan Code of Conduct, and commonly known as either a waiver or release of liability. Generically, a one over the world term, it's called an exculpatory agreement. So a lot of times those terms are used interchangeably, Steve.
Well, this, of course, is full of legalese that I know the law profession makes completely vague and confusing to keep that shit away from the common man. So go ahead and read this statement for the good people.
All right. AEW Fan Code of Conduct. Caution. If you have a seat on the floor, you are at risk of being struck by persons, objects, barricades, and other items. Please be aware of the action as you are watching and move out of the way if someone or something is coming your way. By staying in this area, you assume all risks of injury to yourself and to your property. That's the caution statement that comes up on the big screen at the AEW entrance before AEW shows.
Now, is that enough? And I'm assuming as a layperson, that is their way of covering their bases for what is probably going to be inevitably down the line, someone getting crucially injured at these events. Is that enough to get them out of a lawsuit?
All right, Steve, you've been doing this with me long enough. What's the answer to every question in law school?
Maybe.
Yes, it depends. It depends is the answer to every question in law school. So it depends on where AEW is that night, the state, because this is a very state specific issue, and all 50 state Supreme Courts have weighed in on these issues. And these are called exculpatory agreements. It's a generic term found in a contract, back of a receipt, invoice, or the ticket on the terms of service. As long as it's posted in a prominent position. One party, in this case AEW, seeking to be relieved of blame or liability for some negligence or wrongdoing. Now, you see these all the time in our everyday life if you paid attention. On your dry cleaning ticket, no damage for the dry cleaner for damage to your blouse or suit or whatever done during the dry cleaning process. Warning signs, playgrounds, sports arenas, enter at your own risk, use at your own risk. Occupier of land not liable for damage to vehicle. I saw those at the hospital a lot the last 2 weeks. Rocks falling off the cliff behind Logan Regional Medical Center. Car washes. You always see at car washes not responsible for antennas, mirrors, whatever may be on your truck as you're taking it through a drive-through or some other kind of car wash. So those are examples. And the big distinction that all of these Supreme Courts have found is, does the person know what it is that they're giving up their rights to, in other words? So, I mean, this statement at AEW is very generic. Risk of being struck by persons, objects, barricades, and other items. So, about 5 states have very strict limitations where these can't be used. Another 20 or so states talk about how certain conditions have to be met. California has a 6-part test. And then the other 20 or 25, says that you can't waive an intentional conduct. In other words, like if someone, like say, Sweet Stan Lane of the Midnight Express got out of the ring and punched a guy at the Beckley Armory, there couldn't be enough fine print on the back of that Jim Crockett Promotions ticket to get rid of that kind of conduct. So, and you got 5 states, Ohio and Florida, yours and Resner's states, are pretty much wild, wild west. And they say, look, if these contracting parties, if you go to that and you see that sign, you kind of assume whatever risk it is. It's pretty wide open there.
Now, me and you both were sitting ringside, actually at a very legendary AEW night. It was the night of the CM Punk off-script pipe bomb part 2.
Yeah.
And that night, and by the way, Stephen P. knew his over like a motherfucker at AEW Ringside. And that night especially, and I think this is very self-aware for AEW, and you don't see it as much at WWE, and we'll talk about that in a second. They really do get up close and personal with the crowd, and in ways that I think is dangerous. And I know that night it seemed particularly egregious because a few times there were things that happened. I can't remember exactly what, but where performers, invaded the space of the people who spent a lot of money for those ringside tickets, because ringside tickets for AEW are not cheap. Trust me, I didn't pay for them. Stephen P. did. And you gave out probably 20 cards that day saying, if something happens, give me a call. This could go to AEW kind of acting irresponsibly when the WWE has, obviously like pre-planned things that are going to go through the audience. You always see that they have bodyguards, policemen there,
agents,
keep the people away, agents to keep the people away from the action. AEW, it's like a fucking indie show. Like you may end up with a Young Buck in your lap at those shows.
Sure. And if you recall, in the Young Bucks Kenny Omega's return that night in Charleston, West Virginia, big show, a couple of weeks before All Out. It was in like mid-August of 22. I think that during the Omega Bucks versus Andrade, El Idolo, and
Rouge,
somebody else, one of those Mexican guys, one of those luchadors, went out of the ring and over like 2 rows into the crowd on top of some 8-year-old little girl out there. And I think that's why Tony Khan came out after the show and was kind of glad-handing everybody and was making sure, like, was that 8-year-old crushed to death by Roosh, at ringside? And then the girl right in front of us, who ironically, if you remember, Steve, when we flew the House of Kayfabe guests down to AEW in Miami with Shane Douglas, the people right in front of us at AEW in Charleston just this past August, that was that same family. And one of our friend John's daughters, who's 19 years old, was flopped right over during the Ricky the Dragon Steamboat segment when he came out there during one of the matches. So it's bound to happen at an AEW show. I don't want to reveal how exactly, but I can tell you that there has been some concern raised as well from all the bleeding that happens at AEW shows as well. Now, if blood from one of these wrestlers gets splattered on ringside attendance, Does that waiver of liability cover that? If, God forbid, somebody were to get hepatitis C from infected blood of one of the pro wrestlers, I mean, that's an it depends question. But doggone it, I don't know that you go to a pro wrestling show and you may be on notice that you'll get flipped on now by a young buck or something. Maybe you're also on notice that John Moxley is apt to bleed on you if you have ringside seats.
He bleeds going to the bathroom.
He exactly does. So
he's not shocking anymore.
Well, I mean, from a legal liability standpoint, it's going to go through that same analysis that Supreme Courts do in states where are you fully aware of your rights that you're giving up by this fine print, the click stuff that they talk about that we all just kind of click on the terms of service we understand, and it's a limit on liability, no participation in class actions, and you agree to arbitration for some reason. It varies from state to state, and there's kind of like a 25 states this way, 25 states the other, with no real political or anything. I mean, some states that you think, might let some of that stuff go. It just varies. It's all over the spectrum, Steve.
Now, I know that, one of your other jobs on top of lawyer and podcaster and wrestling fan and wrestling collector is also doing a little lobbying. And I know that one of the things that you lobby for is tort reform. And we talk a lot off air about politics, and tort reform is something that you are very passionate about. Where does this fall in line with what you would call tort reform? And give us a quick tort reform definition.
Sure. Well, a lot of times pro-business entities like the Chamber of Commerce, insurance industry, things like that, like to try to put laws on the books in states to either cap damages, limit liabilities, and that kind of thing, to make the business climate pro-business and a stable business environment in a state. That's their excuse for limiting your God-given right to Seventh Amendment jury trial. But anyway, under tort reform, if a state, particularly if it has a burgeoning industry, I can give you a good example of that, Steve. In the 80s, West Virginia was trying to develop some tourism here. We had whitewater rafting developing here in the New River Gorge area, and snow skiing, snowshoe, Canaan Valley, Winter Place, other places. And the West Virginia legislature at that time in the early 90s put laws on the books that said that those releases of liability, that if you aren't, that if you're just talking about negligence, water on the floor, that kind of thing, that that could be done away with. But you can't have reckless or intentional conduct waived away. And that was done so as to protect and to attract whitewater rafting companies and snow skiing companies to develop that tourism industry in West Virginia. So that's the way that you see that a lot, particularly in entertainment, tourism, things like that. A court and states are probably going to try to put some laws on the books that allow those liability waivers to stand up a little better.
I'm glad you brought that up because, of course, like a good West Virginian, I've done all of those things. And I actually did get hurt at Winter Place once, a senior in high school. I wrenched my knee right before baseball season. But when you do those events or those activities, you read the contract and you sign it. You know what you're getting into. Well, if you're just a lifelong wrestling fan and most of the time went to WCW and WWE, you probably aren't under the assumption that you're going to be entering into a contract just so you can sit and watch some fucking wrestling.
Right. You're not thinking that the action's going to leave the ring, which is why I think if anybody ever challenges this, I've always thought all of those matches that spill out into the arena, go out to the concession stand, Memphis style, R.I.P. Jerry Jarrett, and some other things. I've always thought fans don't expect, the wrestlers to get out where they are, do something, swing a chair, something that's going to injure you so long as you're sitting back. The other thing that would make this interesting would be in a state that has an active athletic commission. If you remember, AEW got fined by the Maryland Athletic Commission a couple of years ago for some stuff that spilled out of the ring. Maryland, and I know because I'm in litigation with Ring of Honor and Sinclair right now, Maryland has some very strict athletic commission rules. Kentucky has some very strict athletic commission rules. And I think if you had athletic commission rules that talk about how wide it's supposed to be from the ring to the participants, what kind of barriers are supposed to be up, because I'm telling you, those little flimsy guardrails that they put up on the sides of AEW shows, those do not pass muster in most of the states that I've seen requiring a barrier, because in Maryland, for instance, the barriers would have to be able to withstand someone coming into, just look how thick WWE's barriers don't even move anymore. That's how thick they are. But it's real interesting. There's a lot of moving parts, Steve, with everything, but the athletic commission rules may actually change some of the dynamic of what the wrestling company might be trying to limit its liability for.
Now, would the athletic commission rules supersede, say, the tort of that state?
What would happen is somebody suing would raise a violation of the athletic commission rule, and a company like, say, AEW would try to raise the exculpatory agreement as a defense, and a judge would have to make a decision early on in the early on stages at like a motion to dismiss stage, whether the action can proceed based upon the violations of the athletic commission rules, which probably constitute negligence per se, and then whether that contract defense of the agreement or the waiver of liability is legitimate. So that issue would get decided very early on in the litigation.
So in closing, I want to cosplay here. Let's just say that I have been gifted ringside tickets again by Stephen P. New, hint, hint. And I catch a young buck in my lap and he breaks my leg, and we're in, say, Ohio, because that's where I live. And you mentioned it earlier. What would be your way, or what would your strategy be to break this contract that I supposedly entered in just by sitting in a chair? What would you do?
Well, it would be hard in your case because you have notice. You've watched a ton of wrestling, so I couldn't plead in my lawsuit that you weren't expecting to get Balding Buck or Road Warrior Buck there in your lap, But
so would that be an issue? Like, so if I were a first-time wrestling a watcher, would that be something that you could bring up and say, this person doesn't know what they're in for?
Yes. If someone just took a wild notion, I don't have anything better to do in Cleveland on a Wednesday night than to go watch Dynamite. Never seen it before, but hey, all my friends are going. Well, the wrestling virgin, the rookie wrestling fan would have a much stronger case because that stuff wouldn't mean anything to them. Now, the old dog that you are there, having watched a lot of this, and as many times as you've heard us, Jim, everybody else in the world make fun of these acrobats flipping out of the ring, AEW could raise that as a defense that you did in fact understand and appreciate and assume that risk of a young buck landing on your lap. Now, I've never looked at Ohio's athletic commission rules, so that may be something that we could use to try to negate that. But I would try to plead around that as much as I possibly could. First thing I'd do would probably be try to get AEW's lawyers on the phone and say, here are my client's medical bills. You represent a billionaire. Let's try to work this out, just amongst us girls here.
Let's stay out of the
confidential manner here that spares AEW the embarrassment of it. Da 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 da. So that's the way that would be handled. But I would not want to get into in Discovery how many wrestling matches you've watched, Steve Barker, whether or not you assume the risk of getting flipped on.
Well, here's the thing, though, but I guess I'm so aware that I know that if I go to a WWE, and I actually have been ringside for house shows at the WWE, I know for a fact that I don't have anything to worry about.
Sure, you can sit there with your hands on your lap.
Completely professional company that has stockholders that they are beholden to, and they are priced in to make sure that my body is not harmed. And that's yet another problem with AEW and the subsidization by a fucking billionaire that that night we saw, like I said, you gave out so many cards that night.
Right. I did it in a joking way, really, but it became a joke at ringside. Like, give me a card, Steve. You don't know what's going to happen.
The AEW has to rein this stuff in, Steve. I think it's going to happen. I mean, it's got to happen. It's going to happen, right?
Yeah, I think it is, because if they would use the coaches they have better to, on the mics and in the refs' ears and everything, just control these matches, control the talent a little more, and let's go ahead and pull the curtain back a little bit. When the talent are going through their moves and all of this stuff, the coach has the reins on that stuff. And you make some consequences and you say, listen, Balding Buck, you go out into the third row on an 8-year-old and we're going to suspend you without pay for 6 months. That's how you'd stop that crap. I could stop it next week if I was vice president of legal, because the first time Balding Buck or some luchador went into the third row on an 8-year-old, they'd be suspended for 6 months with no pay.
Well, Tony Khan's worried about hurting feelings and wants everyone to be his friend, so he would never, ever say anything bad. So there you go. If you are injured if you are that guy or girl that we're talking about, and you get injured by a flying AEW wrestler, you know who to call. Stephen P. New. Thank you all for watching. If y'all like what we're doing, you think we deserve it, please give us a like, a comment, and share. Tell your friends about us. We are in a inundated marketplace, and we're trying to make our spot here. We've got Stephen P. New as the main event, baby. And what's better than that? We'll see you all next time.
Thanks, guys.